Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to the channel. Got an exciting show today because we'll be exploring the deep biological recesses of the human body to discover something amazing, that the human body is mirrored in the prophecies of the Bible. Now, specifically, our discussion is going to center around copper and its relationship to iron in the human body. Now, these are two trace metals that are necessary for human survival. And what we discovered were that these two metals are at enmity with one another in your body, just as the first prophecy in the Bible explains. Now, to this point in our discussions about copper, we've discovered how closely it is related to the serpent and uncleanness. In fact, the root Hebrew words are very close in describing what copper is, what the serpent is, and what unclean means in the Bible. But here's what we didn't know. And I just discovered this when I was putting together today's investigation, is that trace amounts of copper are necessary for human survival, as well as all other living creatures, mammals. So we're going to be talking about the spiritual and physical implications of this fact today. So the first thing we need to do is get into how copper works in mammals. Now, today's show is going to read much like a biology lesson as we get into some of these topics. And basically, even sheep need trace amounts of copper for survival. Think about the implications of that, the sheep and the goats. Goats need much more copper for survival, and rightfully so. They represent the other bloodline. And according to some of these studies, copper is even necessary for cell communication and a key regulator of cell signaling pathways. Let's get into this study here and talk about what all of this means. These cell signaling pathways, these neural pathways, almost as if we were hardwired with copper. Let's read this. Let's go scroll down to the study. Now, the study we're going to be focusing on today and pulling all this information out of is this one. It's called, let me close out some of this stuff so you guys can see this better. It's called Copper Signaling in the Brain and Beyond. And so here's the abstract. We're going to read this first, and then we're going to get into the neurobiology of copper and how it affects our brains and our nervous system. Transition metals have been recognized and studied primarily in the context of their essential roles as structural and metabolic cofactors for biomolecules that compose living systems. Now, as I read through this, I'll be deciphering this for you guys. A lot of this is bio speak, and so it can get a little bit overwhelming. So I will decipher this and break this down for those that don't understand. More recently, an emerging paradigm of transition metal signaling, where dynamic changes and transitional metal pools can modulate protein function. So these metals modulate protein function, cell fate, and organism health and disease. And so it's broadened their view of the potential contributions of these essential nutrients in biology. Using copper as a canonical example of transition metal signaling, we highlight key experiments where direct measurement and or visualization of dynamic copper pools in combination with biochemical, physiological, and behavioral studies have deciphered sources, targets, and physiological effects of copper signals. So basically, this is a study on the role that copper plays in the human body. Now, before we get into this, I want to back up a little bit and show you how copper is at enmity with iron. Taking copper supplements may help people who have anemia because of copper deficiency. Copper works together with iron to form red blood cells, but also if you're taking too much copper, as you'll see here, it can be dangerous and start to interfere with iron absorption. This particular study talks about high iron consumption impairs growth and causes copper deficiency. The two are at enmity with one another. Let's read this abstract quickly before we get into the bigger study that shows the role. Iron-copper interactions were described decades ago. However, molecular mechanisms linking the two essential minerals remain largely undefined. Investigators in human and other mammals noted that copper levels increase in the intestinal mucosa, liver, and blood during iron deficiency. So, copper levels go up when iron goes down. The current study was undertaken to test the hypothesis that dietary copper influences iron homeostasis during iron deficiency and iron overload. So, let's get down to the meat of this. Rats fed low iron diets grew slower than controls, with changes in dietary copper not further influencing growth. Unexpectedly, however, high iron feeding also impaired growth. Furthermore, consumption of high iron diet caused cardiac hypertrophy, anemia, low serum and tissue copper levels, and decreased circulating ceruloplasmin activity. High copper levels in the high iron diet increased serum non-heme iron concentration and transferrin saturation. Serum, let's get down to this part here. We conclude that high iron feeding of weaning rats caused systemic copper deficiency. The two are at enmity with one another, copper versus iron. Now, let's get back into this study and look at the copper and how it interacts in our neural pathways, copper signaling, and neurobiology. Early studies suggesting that copper could serve essential functions outside of enzyme active sites came from the observation by this group. Copper could rapidly release copper upon depolarization. Okay, let's get down into the meat of this. Work from our laboratory provided the first direct imaging evidence for selective and dynamic copper translocation upon neuronal stimulation, showing a redistribution of copper from the cell body to dendrites. Complementary visualization of copper fluxes was observed using fluorescent small molecules. So basically, they saw copper moving between the neuronal pathways, between the dendrites. Mobile neural copper involves labile copper pools. Copper redistribution was dependent on calcium signaling, and additional studies with copper demonstrated that cultured hippocampal neurons and retinal tissue slices contain an endogenous labile pool of copper. So, neurons in the hippocampus and retinal tissues have endogenous copper that can be depleted by treatment with copper chelators, which is some kind of thing that they use. And some neurons contain pools of copper that are required for spontaneous firing and are mobilized during neural depolarization. So neural depolarization is basically the signaling, initiating a copper signal that is dependent on calcium signaling. So we are literally hardwired with copper. Now, this might be unsettling for some people given the fact that we've already researched copper and that it's basically infects our bodies. And this need for these trace amounts of copper in our bodies doesn't seem natural. And we'll get into why that is later in the show. But the effect of copper signaling on neurotransmission has been explored through all of these studies. Beyond neurotransmitter receptors, an early prediction by this person that copper could bind thiols to enable olfactory function was validated in a study. So what does all that mean? Well, what they seem to say here is that that copper is necessary for you to smell sulfur. Copper is necessary for you to smell sulfur. Smelling sulfur. Copper and silver regulate the response of human odorant receptor. Now, why would this be? Let's read this. Mammalian survival depends on ultrasensitive olfactory detection. So this is a survival mechanism. And it looks like here it says skunks exploit this sensitivity with their nauseous sprays. And it is important for us as a survival mechanism to be able to detect volatile sulfur compounds, since these compounds can signal the presence of rancid food, which of course you don't want to eat, O2 depleted atmosphere, so basically if there's not enough oxygen, and which would be like in a deep cave or something where you might smell sulfur, and predators through carnivore excretions. So what they say here is that copper is a regulator of your ability to smell sulfur. While copper is both an essential nutrient for life and an excess a hallmark of various pathologies and neurodegenerative diseases, its involvement in human olfaction, which is smell, has not been previously demonstrated. When screened against a series of alcohols, thiols, sulfides, and metal coordinating ligands, it responds with enhancement by copper to the mouse semiochemical and derivatives, suggesting compact receptor dimensions. So, this is interesting. So now we have a connection between sulfur and copper, which we already knew there was a connection there, didn't we? Because of what the Bible says and how these different peoples were judged with the destruction by sulfur, and how the serpent in the end of times in the book of Revelation will be judged with sulfur, thrown into the lake of fire and brimstone. Brimstone is the old word for sulfur. So here we have another connection to the serpent. Now, as I've dug more into copper, what I found also is that high sugar levels in the body can also cause problems with copper and copper levels in the body competing with copper. Now, what could that be about? Vitamin C as well, and high sugar. People who take high amounts of zinc, iron, or vitamin C may need more copper. Now, don't go crazy and start eating a bunch of copper, because it's very hard on the liver, as are all metals. And so you really have to just eat it naturally. Foods that contain copper is oyster, liver, whole grain, breads and cereals, shellfish, dark leafy green vegetables, dried legumes, nuts, and chocolate. Should say dark chocolate. But isn't it interesting that sugary foods can compete with copper absorption. Maybe this is why they're flooding all of our foods with lots of sugar, so that we can't absorb as much copper that is necessary for good health. Now, I'm not into organ meats like beef and liver and kidneys and heart, but apparently they're high in copper as well. Nuts, butter, cashews, macadamia nuts, almonds, pistachios, fruits and vegetables, and all of this other stuff here. Now, what else do we have here? So, we've covered the neuronal pathways. We've covered your ability to smell sulfur, which is unclean, of course, represents basically evil. Flies are attracted to sulfur, aren't they? But also, copper enzymes also regulate melanin in the skin. Now, we covered that in a previous show, so we're not going to cover that again today. But if you're interested in that, copper regulates melanin in the skin. It's actually a copper enzyme. And also affects the circadian rhythm. Copper affects the circadian rhythm and the brain. Let's find that part in this study here. In addition to copper's role in learning and memory, copper has also been shown to influence circadian rhythm. Now, beyond impacting normal neural function, copper directly interacts with prions as well. We've been talking a lot about prion disease. Well, not all prions are bad prions, but the prions that cause disease are bad. Something happens. They start folding in on one another, don't they? Well, according to this, copper directly interacts with some of these prions. And it talks about a precursor to Huntington and spongiform encephalopathy, Alzheimer's, ALS. And it says here that it may serve as a buffer for copper binding in the extracellular space, perhaps at the synapse, which is the area between the neurons. And APP in the network of proteins that regulate neural copper homeostasis. Copper also alerts the activity of glycogen synthase kinase, an enzyme involved in regulating APP processing, linking copper to APP biology through multiple mechanisms. So basically, that's a big word sandwich for copper is very important in brain and spinal cord health. Now you have to wonder, is this why the Egyptians wore the copper serpent on their foreheads? Because they worshipped the copper inside of them. And they knew about copper biology and how the serpent was mixed with the pure blood iron. You have to wonder. Now I'm trying to sift through this study so that I can pull out the parts that make sense to the layman. This is why I'm slowly going through this. But as you can see, it is directly connected to health and disease in the brain. And these connections have been established on biochemical, physiological, and behavioral levels. Now they've got some references here that you can go to, and I'll attach this study, of course, for those of you that want to read further into this, but the point has been made. We are hardwired with copper. It is very much a part of the signaling of the neural pathways. Although neurobiology has been hinted at the prospects of copper signaling, the identification and study of copper signaling in other tissues with more detailed study of specific molecular targets are rapidly expanding. So, this begs the question, Jive G. human batteries. Basically, our bodies contain the elements of what would be in a battery, the copper top battery. We are basically Duracells, just like the Matrix films depict. And how is that going to interact with this new network that they're building all around us as we speak? Now, what else is copper integral in regulating in the body? Well, according to this, the entire immune response. Now, here's where the plot thickens, because what have we been talking about for the past 3 years? Immune responses. Well, according to this, they found that it is dependent, your immune response is dependent on copper. Copper and immunity. Let's read this. This is unbelievable. So now I'm starting to see some links between copper and everything we've been going through for the past 3 years. Now, I don't know exactly what those links are, but this is crazy. Besides the brain, copper is mobilized in other cells and tissues in response to a variety of stimuli, including infection. The antimicrobial properties of copper have been appreciated for centuries, and today copper is used in medical devices to prevent fouling from microbial growth. Appropriately, the mammalian immune system also uses copper's toxicity to prevent microbial growth. So, our immune system has copper in it to stop things from growing in our bodies. So if you don't have enough copper in your body, then things are going to start to grow in your body, right? What happened to our copper? Innate immune cells such as macrophages respond to infection by internalizing microbes into vesicles called phagosomes, which rapidly acidify and are filled with reactive oxygen species. So this is basically the building blocks of our immune system. In a seminal study, Petries and co-workers showed that in response to bacterial or immune stimuli, the ATP7A copper exporter in macrophages moves to the phagosomal membrane in a copper-dependent manner, suggesting that copper is mobilized within the immune cell during an infection and may be pumped into phagosomes as part of the immune response. We all remember the biology study showing how, a pathogen is handled in the human body. Basically, these cells go out in our immune system and surround the thing, don't they? Well, this is seeming to say that copper is part of that. And this is probably what actually kills the thing that is being encircled by our immune system. Let's keep reading here. Indeed, E. coli cells lacking the bacterial copper exporter are less able to survive internalization within macrophages than wild-type E. coli. But this deficit is ameliorated when E. coli cells are internalized within ATP7A macrophages. This data suggests that phagosomal copper negatively affects bacterial growth, such that bacteria possess copper export machinery able to repel a copper insult. So these bacteria have this mechanism in them that can, when they get attacked by the copper, they try to export the copper out of the cells. Wow. Here they talk about yeast, candida. It may harness mobilized phagosomal copper to augment its virulence. So yeast is actually using copper to be more virulent. Copper hyperaccumulation is necessary for yeast virulence in some systems. Wow. As copper mobilization is an internal part of the innate immune response, manipulating labile copper within immune cells may be a viable therapeutic for microbial infections. For example, cellular treatment with copper increases bioavailable copper within cells, and reduces microbial growth. As the need for new antimicrobial compounds continues to increase, copper may emerge as a valuable linchpin for gaining leverage over microbial pathogens. It goes even deeper because they're saying here that copper is even what modulates tumor growth in cancer. Let's read this. Controlling cancer with labile copper. I think labile means, I don't know what that word means. What does labile mean? Do you guys know in the chat? Let me check in with you guys and we'll start to finish up this study on copper and talk about the spiritual implications of everything we're talking about today. Did somebody look up labile? Let's take a look here in the chat. And then we'll read about cancer. We're also going to read about fat metabolism and how it is manipulated by how much copper is in your body. And if you don't have enough, you won't burn fat. Anybody know what labile means? I mean, I guess I could look it up. Free copper. Okay, thanks, Andre. Free copper. Okay. No, the Father didn't give us copper on purpose. We were infected with it. The wheats and the tares growing up together. You can't separate them until the end of time, till you've lived your life, because that copper is the infection. It is that little bit of sin in you that taints you. That's why you're born into sin. You're born with this. It's actually in your mother's milk, but it's necessary for survival. We'll get into that later. I want to get through this part first. This is the two bloodlines. Blue bloods versus the red bloods. Copper-based organisms versus the red iron-based organisms. And this is why in nature God gave us the blue-blooded organisms, which are all unclean, by the way, as a reference point so we can identify the difference in the bloodlines. Let's read about cancer. It says here, let's get down into the parts of this that we can understand. Substantial research has been dedicated to understanding and manipulating copper in cancer to prevent cancer progression. Delivery of copper to cancer cells, for example, takes advantage of the oxidizing environment in cancer cells, which is less equipped to buffer increases in copper to cause cell death. System chelation of copper has shown positive results in trials for prevention triple-negative breast cancer. Here we emphasize the growing importance of copper in cancer as a regulator of tumor cell proliferation. In cancer as well as healthy cells, the mitogen-activated protein kinase pathway is a signaling cascade that drives cellular proliferation and differentiation. Activating mutations in upstream components of the pathway lead to constitutive signaling, causing tumorigenesis and tumor growth. So, cancer regulates tumor growth. Now, there's a bunch of more word sandwiches in here, but suffice it to say, let's get down to some other parts of this. In melanoma cells carrying the oncogenic BRAF mutation, knockout of the copper importer decreased phospho levels and inhibited cell proliferation. So in other words, they were able to stop the cancer cells from proliferating. Restricting labile copper in mice inhibited the growth of tumors. So less copper, less tumors? This one's a little bit harder to understand, but just understand that copper plays a key role in tumors. It says here, labile copper can play a key role in the growth of cancer, and that restriction of the labile copper pool can inhibit cancer growth. Whoa. The requirement of copper for full MEK activity, probably cancer, that cells or tissues may regulate copper pools to tune the MAPK pathway. So by tuning the pathway, you can do different things to cancer. Integrating a transition metal signal into traditional kinase signal transduction pathways. Indeed, manipulation of copper levels through the administration of copper chelators or ionophores may be an effective way to modulate MAPK signaling, particularly in the context of combination therapies for cancer. Now, what else do we have here? Copper in the regulation of fat metabolism. Why is it that as we get older, it's harder and harder to burn fat, right? Well, let's read about it. Dysregulation of lipid metabolism, fat metabolism, is a symptom of dietary copper deficiency or overload. So you can either have too much or not enough. And so you're not burning fat. Moreover, during the progression of diet-induced non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, liver copper levels decrease. Okay, so copper is stored in the liver, and the bile in your body either releases it or holds on to it. And if it's holding on to too much, then you'll have copper toxicity. There's a couple of different reasons why that happens, but a lot of people don't have enough copper. So what happens is they get issues. Let's read about it. In addition, such nutritional studies linking copper and fat metabolism, the mouse model of Wilson disease, which lacks the copper exporter and accumulates copper in the liver, shows changes in lipid metabolism in the liver before traditional Wilson disease symptoms, such as inflammation and liver failure. A liver-specific ATP7B knockout mouse develops lipid dysregulation without inflammation, suggesting that metabolic symptoms may be directly linked to copper levels and not a secondary symptom of liver inflammation observed in Wilson disease. So these studies linking long-term changes in copper to changes in fat metabolism work from our laboratory identified copper as a newly recognized allosteric regulator of this that controls lipolysis in adipocytes. Your fat adipocytes are the fat cells. Lipolysis is the breaking down of triglycerides into glycerol and fatty acids. So, complicated systems our body has, right? But you're getting the drift of this as well. Copper is integral in this burning of fat. Copper deficient adipose tissue isolated from this mouse and stimulated with whatever. Okay, that's getting a little bit complicated. Let's keep reading down here and see if they have a summary sentence. A copper signal acts through allosteric modulation to affect lipolysis in cells and animals. And the data demonstrated the intersection of copper signaling with signaling through the second messenger. Together with dietary and genetic studies, these biochemical studies suggest that manipulation of copper levels may be a viable option for influencing molecular pathways controlling fat metabolism and treating diseases involving dysregulation of lipid homeostasis. Wow. So, now we're going to read the very last paragraph of this study because this is very important. In addition to exploring the origins of copper signals, the ability to manipulate copper signaling may prove an effective therapy, whether alone or in combination with existing therapies, for diseases such as neurodegeneration, infection, cancer, and obesity. Manipulation of copper levels may be achieved most simply by adjustment of dietary copper intake, whereas targeted delivery of copper supplements, chelidars or ionophores to specific organs, could serve to mitigate potential toxicities associated with systemic changes to copper homeostasis. So you can either eat it, or they've got these specialized ways to that give targeted delivery. I don't know what these things are, if they're like little stents they put in your body. I don't know what that is, but apparently there's ways to target even more specifically above and beyond eating it in your diet. Finally, this short discussion has focused on copper, but this metal represents just one transition metal signaling element in the periodic table of life, and opportunities spanning chemistry, biology, and engineering of metals will surely contribute to a better global understanding of health, aging, and disease. Now, what this says to me is that this is a sign that the entire human race has been contaminated with the serpent copper blue blood. And this gives a whole new context to the copper top battery, doesn't it? Now, I promised you we would get into sulfur, because as we said, in order to smell sulfur, you have to go through copper. Sulfur is the danger odor. And of course, we know that sulfur is often associated with the serpent, the devil. Here's sulfur in the Bible. It's called brimstone, mentioned 14 times in the King James Version of the Bible. And in Isaiah, let's go down to Isaiah here. They show here it's mentioned in a judgment of these peoples. Now, when I go back into this chapter that talks about brimstone in Isaiah, just before this, they actually mention the fiery serpents. The burden of the beasts of the south into the land of trouble and anguish, from whence come the young and old lion, the viper and fiery flying serpent. Probably the same Hebrew words used during the punishment of the Hebrews when they were begging to go back to Egypt. They were attacked by fiery flying serpents. Now this word fiery actually means copper. It's the same word, because copper looks fiery, doesn't it? But you'll see in the Old Testament, when the Israelites were attacked by these fiery serpents, that the word is actually bronze or fiery or copper. So later on in this same chapter is where Isaiah talks about brimstone. For Tophet is ordained of old, for the king it is prepared. He hath made it deep and large. The pile thereof is fire and much wood. The breath of the Lord, like a stream of brimstone, doth kindle it. So, now we see the relationship between copper and sulfur. Just like you need it to smell the sulfur, the two are related. Sulfur is death. So copper is what allows us to smell that death. Now, remember too, that sulfur is the crowned serpent. There's another clue. Sulfur is the crowned serpent, the king of death. Why do I say that? Well, there's a molecule. This is it. It is called the antiprism S8 molecule, and it looks like a double crown. This is the same shape they chose for the one world center of trade, an antiprism, a giant sulfur molecule pointing up toward heaven. Brimstone, the same thing that destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, here's the interesting thing about sulfur. I told you this was going to be a chemistry biology lesson today. Sulfur can form compounds with other elements. All other elements. Principal ores of copper, zinc, nickel, cobalt, molybdenum, and other metals are sulfides. The principal ores are sulfides. So when you find it in the earth, it's a sulfide mixed with sulfur. Sulfur and copper together again. Now, the only elements in the periodic table that do not bind with the sulfides are the gases, the noble gases, as it says here. But this is very interesting nonetheless. In fact, copper ore is a sulfide. So in other words, it is basically created by a reaction with hydrogen sulfide. So what this suggests is that sulfur is an integral part of the metals and actually all elements on the periodic table. Sulfur has literally contaminated our entire reality. And so now the truth emerges about the copper serpent on the pole. And Jesus raised up on the cross the same way. What does that really mean? Why did Jesus say, just as the serpent was raised up, so too the Son of Man will be raised up? It's because we need copper to live in these bodies, don't we? Because the serpent rules this world. But to live beyond this life, we need the purifying blood, the iron blood of Jesus. And the copper competes with that iron, doesn't it? As we demonstrated. So the two are at enmity with one another. Too much iron and you won't absorb copper, which you need to survive. So the two shall grow together, the wheat and the tares. Now, we did a study on the tares, didn't we? And we found that ragweed, which is a probable candidate for what the Bible is talking about when it's talking about tares, was very high in copper content. In fact, ragweed has the highest copper content of almost any plant. We also looked at cephalaria, which is also a candidate for what the tare is mentioned in the Bible. And it also has much more copper than wheat. Whereas wheat is iron dominant, and you can eat a lot of it and get iron without getting other toxicities. And now we understand what the parable meant. Now we understand what the parable meant. The wheat and the tares, both are inside of us. The iron and the copper. You can't take one out because you'll die. They have to grow up together. You have to battle the sin within you. You have to battle the unclean spirit. You have to battle that. Overcome it in your life through the power of the Holy Spirit. As God refines you. And at the end of time, there's the harvest. And then he can pull it up, right? And basically determine whether or not we are saved. Now, I have one last thing before we get off of here. The Bible says that the eyes are the window to the soul. And that definitely applies to health, doesn't it? In fact, the eyes of people who have too much copper toxicity, their eyes turn copper colored. Wilson's disease. Here's a very obvious example here. A blue-eyed person with copper toxicity, and it forms a ring, a halo, a corona around the eye. So, isn't God amazing? Revealing the metaphors of biology in our bodies and relating that back to the Bible. Now here's the miracle. The miracle isn't that we found this or God revealed this to us. That's not the real miracle here. The real miracle is that the Word of God contained complex biology and chemistry in the actual words of a book that was written down thousands of years ago before anybody knew this. Complex biology and chemistry, the role of copper, the fact that there's even copper in a weed or a tear that competes with iron, the way that iron reacts with copper, the enmity between them. None of that was known 2,000 years ago. Now people argue that, oh, the Egyptians already knew all that stuff. No, they didn't. Otherwise, he would have written it down. They had the serpent on their forehead, the copper serpent, but that was pretty much the extent of it. They used copper quite a bit, but this is just amazing. This is amazing, and we're discovering it all right now. So, what does this mean for your health? Well, you need a little bit of copper, apparently. And so, make sure that you're not just taking iron by itself. You know, in fact, zinc also competes with copper. Now, here is where things get crazy. Because during cold season, according to this article here, I got to make sure I get this part in as well, because this is very important. People dose themselves with lots of zinc and vitamin C, and they actually cause themselves to be deficient in iron. I'm sorry, not iron, copper. Let's look this up here. This is crazy. Be aware that whole grains contain phthalates that bind copper, zinc, and other minerals. This is not to suggest that people shouldn't eat whole grains, but they shouldn't take minerals at the same time. People often do not understand that it matters when and with what they take their supplements. Much like calcium and magnesium, copper and zinc have a sometimes synergistic, sometimes antagonistic relationship. When the balance of zinc and copper is right, these processes proceed well. But, like calcium and magnesium, too much of one diminishes the other. Excesses of either zinc or copper can cause problems. What do we do during the cold and flu season? Let's read. And this is where the Bible is so wise in giving us counsel. It says do everything in moderation. In other words, dosing yourself with large doses of vitamin C, what have we been told? We've been told, oh, your body just doesn't absorb it. It harmlessly passes through your body. But look at what it really does. During the winter cold and flu season, many people unwittingly induce copper deficiency by gobbling zinc lozenges and heavy doses of vitamin C, believing this will enhance immunity and increase antioxidant capacity. But both zinc and vitamin C compete with or interfere with copper absorption. Because copper is essential for production and activation of neutrophils and all the other things we discovered, right? The first line of defense against pathogens, these neutrophils, Excess zinc and vitamin C may actually render people more susceptible to the very ailments they're seeking to avoid. In other words, you start dosing a bunch of zinc and vitamin C. Now, look, eating it daily is fine. And in the context of everything we just read, it's fine. But the minute you start feeling sick, the last thing you should be doing is starting to dose yourself with all this stuff, because you're actually going to make yourself sick. 2 recent papers review the role of copper and other trace minerals in both cellular and humoral immunity. These guys suggest and illustrate that the vicious cycle occurring when micronutrient deficiency suppress T-cell mediated and adaptive antibody responses, thus increasing susceptibility to infection, which in turn increases micronutrient loss, interferes with the metabolism of many nutrients, and reduces nutrient intake. They point out that careful micronutrient supplementation can boost immune function and reduce infection susceptibility. So, make sure your copper and iron levels are correct, and you probably won't get sick. Copper is essential for synthesis of one form of superoxide dismutase, and anything that reduces copper also reduces SOD, diminishing overall antioxidant capacity. People who take high-dose vitamin C to boost their antioxidants may be surprised to learn that they're actually inducing the opposite effect. Anything over 1,000 milligrams of vitamin C per day interferes with copper. So there's your target right there. You don't want to go anything over 1,000 milligrams per day, or you're going to be interfering with your copper. The best way to increase overall antioxidant capacity is by increasing intake of antioxidant-rich foods rather than amplifying one antioxidant vitamin out of the many. Wow. So again, I'll put links to all this. I know many of you are chomping at the bit to get these links so you can understand all this. But basically it boils down to moderation, right? Moderation. You don't want to be just downing a bunch of iron all the time without taking the other things with it. Maybe iron and copper together. I don't know. All right, you guys. Wow, that was a lot of stuff. I know some of it was a bit complicated, but hopefully I summarized much of it for you. Let's go into the chat here for a little bit, because I'm curious to see what your guys' thoughts are on all this. All right. Maybe higher copper content in lettuce is key. Yeah, I wouldn't stop eating lettuce. I know I posted something about romaine lettuce having the highest copper content. That was more of an observation and not a recommendation to stop eating romaine lettuce. It appears as though after further study that copper is integral in our bodies functioning properly. But it's also on a spiritual level a sign of the dependence. Think about that for a second, you guys. The copper snake on the pole, that's the side that medicine wants us to go to, isn't it? They want to heighten the copper, don't they? They want us to go to the side of our blood that is dominant with the copper. That's what that means. And Jesus is on the other pole, the other cross. And he wants us to come to him. The two are at enmity with each other. It's so clear to me. I'm just jumping out of my skin right now, because I'm trying to say the right words to help you understand this, because it is very important. It is very important. Now, if you want to really get your mind blown, you look into copper toxicity and what happens when you have too much of it. And there are different kinds of things about that as well that can happen, that seem to mimic a lot of what's happening around us, doesn't it? With how people get sick. So, copper is important for dental health. Daily fasting is the healthiest way to live. I agree with that as well. I could do a lot more fasting. Eat your greens. Yes. Explain the eye thing. Well, it's a spiritual manifestation. Okay. You've got too much copper and you can actually get Wilson's disease, which is rings in the eye. And isn't it weird that that looks a lot like a corona around the sun, or a corona, a ring? And that the crown, and then the sulfur has the crown as well, the sulfur 8. I mean, to me, the two seem very closely related, and it seems to be spiritually saying something to us. These are called Kaiser Fleischer rings. That's what they're called. Now, most people get what's called a limbal ring around the iris, and it's a dark ring, and those are supposed to symbolize beauty and aesthetic positivity. In other words, people with limbal rings, prominent limbal rings, are said to have more beautiful eyes. Here's an example. There's a normal limbal ring. The darker the ring, I guess it sets the color off, maybe like an outline, and then it turns into a Fleischer ring with too much copper. So this person would be copper dominant, right? So maybe like more of the copper, the blue blood starting to take over. Now, here's where things get interesting. Start looking at celebrities and see if you see this copper dominance in their eyes. And this is where you're probably going to see the intermixed bloodlines. Okay? I'm just guessing here on that. We'll have to research that and see if we see that. But that would be an indication that they're blue blood dominant, copper dominant. Wouldn't it? So, interesting. Most beings are iron and toxic and copper deficient. Wow. It's also interesting to note that they said in some of these studies that we reviewed that what usually looks like anemia, iron deficiency, is actually copper deficiency. And someone could have plenty of iron but lacks the copper. Let's read this here. Thanks, Eric. Let's read your comment here. So we need a balance. Yes, everything's about balance of iron, zinc, copper, vitamin D, and C. Yes, that is absolutely correct, Eric. Thanks for joining the channel membership. But that is absolutely correct. So when we're talking about these elements here, these trace metals, and we're talking about it, we're really talking about the spiritual metaphors, aren't we? You shouldn't try to get rid of copper in your body because your body actually needs it. But it's a sign that the nature of our reality has become dependent on this copper. It doesn't seem to be there naturally. It seems to be there as some kind of infection, doesn't it? And that came from the bloodlines and how all of creation was basically tainted or infected. That's what this says to me when we really dig into this with everything that we've been talking about. So, all right, you guys, I know that was a really in-depth study, but I know many of you enjoy these studies much more than the Between the Headlines. We will be back on here tomorrow with Between the Headlines. Got several stories pulled up, more people falling out of windows. This is just unbelievable. I guess this guy, inside California's green crisis, someone sent me this, and there was a guy who was like a farmer of the green. He fell out of a window. This just keeps going on and on and on. We're also going to talk about the kangaroo court surrounding Thump, and the lead prosecutors basically resigned because there is no case. So it was a big nothing sandwich just to spur the right-left paradigm. We're also going to talk about the newest honey trap, Truth Social, that didn't even really go live yet, but yet they had 300,000 people's names and information loaded up in there who were trying to get on the site. Talk about that. So, a lot to talk about tomorrow on Friday. Hopefully see you guys all there. Love each and every one of you guys. And we will see you guys then. Take care and be safe.